The courtroom buzzed with a tense energy, the kind that crackled like static electricity. All eyes were on Judge Naomi Harris as she adjusted her glasses, preparing to deliver a verdict that would shape the future of one of the state's most powerful corporate empires. It should have been a moment of respect and anticipation. Instead, it became a stage for prejudice. "Your Honor," Martin Blake's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He stood abruptly, eyes blazing with indignation. "I'm sorry, but I cannot in good conscience allow this farce to continue." The words hung in the air, freezing the room in stunned disbelief. Martin's gaze swept the room, challenging anyone to oppose him. He was a seasoned litigator, known for his razor-sharp tongue and his ability to bend the law to his will. But this was something different. "This is not about the law. This is about respect," he continued, voice rising. "How can we let someone who got this position through diversity quotas, not merit, preside over a case of this magnitude?" Gasps echoed through the room. A murmur of outrage rippled through the audience, but Martin didn't care. His gaze was locked on Judge Harris, his expression daring her to respond. Judge Harris looked at him calmly, her face an unreadable mask. She didn't flinch. She didn't rise to his bait. Instead, she picked up her gavel, its polished surface gleaming under the courtroom lights. "Mr. Blake," she said softly, her voice steady, "you will have your say, but understand this. Respect is not given. It is earned, and I have earned my place here." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she banged the gavel down. The sound reverberated like a thunderclap, signaling not just the start of the trial, but the beginning of Martin Blake's downfall. The sound of the gavel seemed to echo in Martin's ears long after the courtroom emptied. He sat alone at his desk, gripping the polished wood so hard his knuckles turned white. His thoughts churned, roiling with indignation and disbelief. How could this happen? How could she stand there so calm, so unflinching, as if his words had no weight? It made no sense. "Mr. Blake?" His assistant's hesitant voice broke through the haze of his anger. She stood in the doorway, holding a stack of legal documents, her eyes wide and uncertain. "What?" Martin snapped, the word sharper than intended. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to unclench his jaw. "What is it, Samantha?" There's been a media request for a statement regarding today's trial," she said cautiously. "They want to know if you plan to issue a formal apology." "An apology?" Martin's laugh was harsh, almost bitter. "For what? For speaking the truth? For standing up for standards?" Samantha shifted uncomfortably, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. "Well, sir, it's not just the media. The partners at the firm are concerned. There's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning." "Of course there is," he muttered, rising from his chair. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls lined with rows of leather-bound law books that suddenly felt oppressive. "I know what they're thinking. They want me to grovel, to bow my head and pretend I'm sorry." He paced restlessly, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. "But I won't do it. This is exactly what's wrong with the system. People like her, they're taking over, pushing real talent out." "Sir," Samantha interjected softly, her gaze flicking to the door as if expecting someone to burst in. "Judge Harris isn't just—" "I know what she is," Martin spat, turning on his heel to face her. "She's a symbol, a token, a way for them to feel good about themselves while they undermine the real work of this profession." Samantha opened her mouth as if to say something but seemed to think better of it. She nodded curtly and turned to leave, pausing only for a moment at the door. "Good night, Mr. Blake." "Yeah, good night." He waved her off distractedly, already lost in thought again. But as the door clicked shut behind her, Martin was left alone with a silence that felt heavy, suffocating. He sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples as if to ward off the throbbing headache building behind his eyes. He knew he was right. He had to be. But for the first time in his career, a sliver of doubt crept in. Not because of Judge Harris's calm composure or the way the room seemed to rally around her. No, it was something far more insidious. A memory, unbidden and unwanted, rising from the dark recesses of his mind. 30 years earlier. The estate was a sprawling expanse of manicured lawns and towering oaks, the kind of place that spoke of old money and unyielding tradition. Young Martin Blake, no more than 8 at the time, stood on the veranda, his posture rigid as his father's deep voice thundered through the open doors. "You'll be going to the academy next year, Martin," his father declared, his gaze stern and unyielding. "It's time to start building your legacy. The Blakes have always been leaders. You have a reputation to uphold." "Yes, father," Martin replied obediently, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing figure before him. "And remember," his father continued, leaning down until their faces were inches apart, "strength comes from knowing your place and making sure others know theirs. Never let anyone take what's rightfully yours, especially not those who don't belong." Martin swallowed hard, the words searing into his young mind like a brand. He nodded stiffly, his eyes wide and solemn. "Good." His father straightened, satisfied. "Now, go play with your sister, and remember what I've told you." As he turned to go, Martin glanced back, catching sight of a small figure standing in the shadow of the grand staircase. A boy, about his age, with dark skin and wide, frightened eyes. One of the servants' children, no doubt. For a moment their gazes locked, and Martin felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation twist in his chest. He wanted to look away, to dismiss the boy as insignificant, just as his father would have. But something held him there, rooted to the spot. "Hey!" he called out impulsively. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, glancing nervously around before whispering, "Marcus, sir." "Marcus?" Martin repeated thoughtfully. "Well, Marcus, you should know something. My father says people like you don't belong here. You should go back to where you came from." The boy's eyes filled with hurt, but he didn't argue. He simply bowed his head and turned, disappearing silently into the shadows. And just like that, the uncomfortable sensation in Martin's chest evaporated, replaced by a smug sense of satisfaction. He had done what his father wanted. He had asserted his place. He was a Blake, after all, present day. The memory faded, leaving Martin staring blankly at the empty office around him. His heart pounded erratically, the echo of his father's voice still ringing in his ears. "Know your place. Make sure others know theirs." It had been his mantra for years, the creed that guided his actions, his decisions, his entire career. And it had served him well. Until now, because for the first time he was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, his father had been wrong. The thought was unsettling, almost blasphemous, but it wouldn't go away. It gnawed at him, a tiny seed of doubt that threatened to sprout and grow, cracking the foundation of everything he believed. And as he sat there, alone in the silence, Martin realized something else, something far more terrifying. He didn't know what to do, because for the first time in his life he was no longer certain of his place. The next morning, Martin arrived at the office early, determined to regain control of the situation. But the moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The usual bustle of the law firm had been replaced by a tense, almost expectant hush. People glanced up as he walked past, their gazes lingering with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "What's going on?" he demanded, cornering one of the junior associates in the hallway. The young man shifted nervously, his eyes darting to the side. Sir, I think you should see this." He handed Martin a newspaper, his hands trembling slightly. The headline blared in bold, unforgiving letters. "Racist lawyer Martin Blake Sparks, outrage in courtroom meltdown." Below it, a grainy photo captured the moment perfectly. Martin standing, red-faced and furious, pointing accusatorily at Judge Harris as she looked on with calm disdain. And beneath that, a single damning quote. "People like her don't belong here." Martin's vision blurred. He dropped the newspaper as if it burned him, his pulse roaring in his ears. This wasn't just a complaint. This wasn't just a meeting. This was his career, his life, and it was falling apart. The article spread like wildfire. By noon, every major news outlet had picked up the story, and Martin's phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some angry, some supportive, and others dripping with schadenfreude. He deleted them all, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in on him. By the time he reached the office boardroom for the partners' meeting, his heart pounded erratically. The partners, all white, all men, sat around the polished oak table, their expressions unreadable. As he stepped inside, the room fell silent, and every gaze turned toward him. "Martin, take a seat," senior partner Robert Harkness said quietly, gesturing to the lone chair at the end of the table. It felt more like a witness stand than a seat of power. He obeyed, the silence stretching unbearably until Harkness leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Do you have any idea what kind of damage this has caused?" Martin swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Harkness's gaze. "It's being blown out of proportion. The media—" "This isn't the media, Martin," Harkness interrupted sharply. "This is us, your partners, your colleagues. Your reputation is tarnished, and by extension, so is ours. We can't afford this kind of scandal." The word "scandal" reverberated in the room like a gunshot. Martin's palms were slick with sweat, but he kept his expression impassive. "So what?" he said flatly. "Are you going to fire me?" There was a beat of silence. Then, to his shock, Harkness shook his head. "No, we're not firing you. We're giving you a choice." "A choice?" "Yes." Harkness's gaze was cold, unyielding. "You either make a public apology or take an indefinite leave of absence until this blows over, or we'll sever ties permanently." The words struck him like a physical blow. An apology? An indefinite leave? To admit fault? To bow to the pressure? It was unthinkable. He'd rather be disbarred than grovel like a coward. But as he looked around the room, at the stony faces of the men he'd once called allies, he realized that he no longer had allies here. He had enemies. They were going to make an example out of him, whether he liked it or not. "You can't be serious," he whispered, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "We're very serious," Harkness replied evenly. "You've got until the end of the day to decide." Martin stared at him, at the people he had worked alongside for decades, but all he saw in their eyes was the same cold calculation he'd shown others for so long. Finally, he pushed his chair back and stood. "I'll let you know." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, ignoring the murmured whispers that followed him. But as he stalked through the corridors, something broke inside him. He felt adrift, unmoored, the very foundations of his life crumbling beneath him. What was happening? How had it all gone so wrong, so quickly? The answer eluded him, slipping through his grasp like smoke. But one thing was certain. He needed to regain control, and to do that, he needed a plan. Later, that evening, Martin sat alone in his apartment, staring blankly at the flickering glow of his computer screen. He had typed out a dozen drafts of the apology they wanted, each one more insipid and humiliating than the last. He deleted them all. How could he apologize for something he didn't believe was wrong? For defending the principles he'd been raised on, the principles that had built his career. It felt like a betrayal, not just of himself, but of everything he stood for. But what choice did he have? With a growl of frustration, he slammed his laptop shut and rose, pacing restlessly. His mind buzzed with half-formed thoughts, fragments of conversations, memories long buried. He needed air, he needed clarity, he needed a drink. Grabbing his coat, Martin stormed out of the apartment and headed for the bar down the street, a small, dimly lit place where the lawyers of the city often gathered to commiserate after tough cases. The familiar surroundings offered little comfort tonight. Every face seemed to be staring at him, every conversation a hushed whisper of judgment. Ignoring them, he ordered a whiskey and took a seat at the bar, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid swirling in his glass. "What's the matter, Blake?" a voice behind him drawled. "Didn't get enough attention in the courtroom today?" Martin stiffened. He turned slowly to find Michael Sterling, a rival attorney, leaning casually against the bar. Sterling's grin was all teeth, his eyes bright with malicious amusement. "Sterling," Martin growled. What do you want? Me? Nothing. Sterling shrugged innocently. Just enjoying the show. It's not every day the mighty Martin Blake takes a nosedive. Martin's hands tightened around his glass. Careful, Sterling. You don't want to push me right now. Or what? Sterling's grin widened. You'll do what? Ruin my career? Destroy my reputation? Oh, wait, that's your specialty. Martin felt his temper flare, hot and sharp. But before he could respond, Sterling's expression shifted, becoming almost thoughtful. Tell me something, Blake, he murmured, leaning in closer. What does it feel like to know your entire world is crumbling? To watch everything you've built slip through your fingers? The question hit harder than any insult. Martin recoiled, his mouth suddenly dry. Get out of my face, he snarled. Sterling chuckled softly. Suit yourself. But remember this, Blake. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to admit you were wrong. With that, he straightened and sauntered away, leaving Martin seething in silence. But long after Sterling was gone, his words lingered, twisting in Martin's mind like a thorn. The only way to save yourself is to admit you were wrong. Wrong. The word tasted bitter. Foreign. He'd spent his entire life making sure he was never wrong, that he was always in control, always on top. To admit otherwise, it would destroy him. But as he stared down at his reflection in the glass, a thought whispered through the turmoil. What if I'm already destroyed? Martin tossed and turned that night, sleep eluding him. When he finally drifted off, he found himself standing in a familiar place, a courtroom. But something was off. The walls were too tall, stretching upward into darkness. The benches were empty, the air thick and oppressive. And at the judge's bench, a single figure sat, cloaked in shadow. Mr. Blake, the figure intoned, its voice echoing eerily in the empty chamber. Step forward. Martin tried to speak, but no sound came out. Panic gripped him as his legs moved of their own accord, carrying him to the center of the courtroom. Do you know why you're here? The judge asked. He shook his head frantically, his heart pounding. You're here because you have been judged, the figure said softly. Not by the law, but by your own soul. And then the figure leaned forward, and Martin's blood ran cold. It was Judge Naomi Harris, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. You silenced a voice of truth, Mr. Blake, she murmured. And now you will face the consequences. With a deafening crash, the gavel came down, and Martin woke up, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. But the words echoed in his ears long after he awoke. You silenced a voice of truth. Now you will face the consequences. The next morning, Martin could hardly focus. The vision of Judge Harris lingered in his mind like a haunting refrain. He kept telling himself it was just a nightmare, nothing more than his overworked brain projecting his anxieties. But the words, you silenced a voice of truth. Now you will face the consequences. What did it mean? What consequences? He shoved the thought aside as he entered the firm. His decision was made. He wouldn't grovel, he wouldn't apologize. His career would survive this storm, and he would come out stronger. He just needed to ride out the backlash, maintain his position, and fight. But as he pushed through the glass doors of his office, he froze. There was a letter on his desk, handwritten, with no return address. Martin's heart skipped a beat as he tore it open. When you refuse to hear, the silence will speak louder than any words. Let the darkness guide you to the light. M.S. What the hell? Martin muttered, staring at the looping script. M.S.? Michael Sterling? Had this rival lawyer somehow managed to worm his way into his personal life? Was this some kind of twisted game? With a snarl, he crumpled the note and threw it into the trash, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling coiling in his gut. As if on cue, his assistant knocked softly at the door. Mr. Blake, the partners would like to know your decision. For a moment, he was tempted to go along with it, to give them what they wanted. But the defiance rose in him, hot and stubborn. Tell them I'm not making a statement, he said coldly. Samantha hesitated. But, sir, That's final, he snapped. She gave a small nod, backing out of the room. Martin exhaled slowly, massaging his temples. He needed to clear his head to come up with a strategy. But the day dragged on, each minute crawling by in an agonizing haze of anxiety and second-guessing. Clients started canceling meetings. His phone rang incessantly with reporters demanding a comment, and every time he caught his reflection, whether in the glass doors, the polished desk, or even the windows, he thought he saw a flicker of something strange in his own eyes. Fear. That night, Martin barely noticed the drive home. He slammed the door of his apartment shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. His head ached, a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to radiate through every nerve. With a frustrated growl, he grabbed a bottle of scotch from the cabinet and poured himself a generous glass. He needed to numb the pounding in his skull, to drown out the relentless pressure. But as he raised the glass to his lips, he froze. The mirror in his hallway, the one his wife had insisted on keeping despite his protests, was covered in writing. "Consequences are not mine to give. They are yours to face." The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. His heart raced, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared at the message, the dark letters scrawled in what looked like ink? Paint? No, it couldn't be real. He blinked, shaking his head furiously. And just like that, the writing was gone. The mirror was spotless, reflecting only his own pale, terrified face. "I'm losing it," Martin whispered, stumbling back. I'm losing my mind." He ran a hand through his hair, gripping it tightly as if to anchor himself. This was stress. Just stress. Too much pressure, too many sleepless nights. That was all. But as he turned to go to bed, his gaze caught something, a faint outline, just visible at the edge of the mirror. Two dark eyes staring back at him. With a choked cry, Martin turned and fled, heart hammering wildly in his chest. The next day was a blur of humiliation and confusion. His firm put out a public statement distancing themselves from his remarks. They placed him on an indefinite suspension, citing a need to review his conduct. Martin watched the press conference from home, feeling hollow, numb. "Martin Blake's comments do not reflect the values of our firm," Robert Harkness announced solemnly. "We believe in equality, in respect for all individuals. We apologize to Judge Harris and the community at large for the harm caused." Martin stared at the screen, his hands shaking. This was really happening. Everything was crumbling, just as Sterling had taunted. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Hesitant, he answered. "Blake?" "Hello, Martin?" The voice was deep, calm, and unfamiliar. "I've been waiting for you." "Who the hell is this?" Martin demanded. "That's not important. What's important is what happens next." The line crackled, and then the voice dropped to a soft murmur. "You silenced a voice of truth, Martin. Now it's your turn to be silenced." A cold chill washed over him. "Who are you? What do you want?" But the line was dead. Martin cursed, throwing the phone across the room. He pressed his hands to his temples, squeezing his eyes shut. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't the media or his firm. It was something else. Something darker. The next few days blurred together. Martin barely left his apartment. He couldn't bear to face the world, to see his life unravel in slow motion. He ignored the calls, the emails, the endless barrage of messages demanding an apology. Then the notes began arriving. Handwritten letters slipped under his door, left on his windowsill, each one more cryptic than the last. When you refuse to see, the blind will lead the way. Truth is patient, but time is not. Your silence is louder than your words. They filled his apartment, littering every surface. Martin burned some, tore others into shreds, but they kept coming, relentless and unceasing. One morning, he found a letter waiting on his pillow, the ink smeared as if it had been written in haste. "The trial of the soul awaits. You have been judged." That night, he didn't sleep. Martin stood in the empty courtroom, the silence deafening. He knew this place. The high ceilings, the polished wood, the towering bench. It was his domain, his sanctuary. But now, it felt like a prison. The judge's bench loomed above him, shrouded in shadow. And there, seated with the calm authority of 1,000 judgments, was Judge Naomi Harris. "Mr. Blake," she intoned, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness, "the time has come." He tried to speak, to protest, but no words came. He was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of her gaze. "You silenced a voice of truth," she said softly, "but the truth cannot be silenced forever." And then, slowly, she stood, her figure impossibly tall and imposing. The gavel gleamed in her hand, heavy and final. "You are guilty, Martin Blake," she whispered. "Guilty of arrogance, guilty of prejudice, guilty of closing your eyes to the world around you." "No," Martin croaked, his voice a thin, broken sound. I'm not." But she only shook her head, her gaze filled with a sadness that pierced his soul. "Justice is not about punishment," she murmured. "It's about transformation." And with that, she raised the gavel high. "No, please!" Martin screamed. But the gavel came down, a thunderous crash that reverberated through the courtroom, through his bones, through his very soul. And Martin Blake woke up. But this time, he wasn't in his bed. He was back in his office, alone in the dark. And the word, guilty, was carved into the glass of his desk, the letters stark and unyielding. Martin fell to his knees, a broken sob escaping his lips, because he knew, deep down, that the nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun. Martin awoke the next morning feeling as if he were submerged in a fog. Every sound seemed muffled, every movement sluggish. He stared blankly at the carved letters on his desk, guilty. The word taunted him, mocking his every attempt to rationalize what was happening. It was a message he couldn't ignore, no matter how desperately he tried to cling to his old self. He knew what he had to do, even if every fiber of his being rebelled against it. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed Samantha's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Mr. Blake? I want to issue a public apology," he said quietly. Silence stretched on the line. When Samantha finally spoke, there was a note of disbelief in her voice. You're serious?" "Yes," he bit out, his jaw tight. "Draft it for me. Schedule a press conference. Make sure it's today." There was a pause, and then she said softly, "I think that's a good idea, sir. I'll take care of it." Martin hung up, staring at the phone as if it were a foreign object. An apology. A public, groveling display of contrition. Everything he had fought against. Everything that went against his nature. But what choice did he have? His career, his reputation, his sanity, all of it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Maybe this was the only way to regain control. That afternoon. The press conference was set up in the lobby of the law firm, the backdrop adorned with the firm's logo in stark, minimalist white. Reporters milled around, murmuring to one another, their cameras trained on the podium where Martin would speak. He stood off to the side, watching with a detached sense of dread. He should be focusing on his speech, on making sure he said the right things. But his mind was elsewhere, back in that nightmare courtroom, back with Judge Harris and her damning words. Guilty. Would this apology be enough to change that? Could a few words erase a lifetime of prejudice and arrogance? "Mr. Blake, we're ready for you," Samantha whispered. He nodded numbly, stepping forward as the murmurs in the room quieted. Dozens of eyes turned to him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and thinly veiled hostility. Martin took a deep breath, his palms sweating. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice sounding strange and hollow in the silence. Thud. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it froze Martin in his tracks. He glanced around, his pulse spiking. Had anyone else heard it? Thud, thud. There it was again, like the distant echo of a gavel striking wood. "Mr. Blake?" a reporter called out, impatience edging his tone. "You were saying?" Martin forced himself to focus. It's in your head, he told himself firmly. Just nerves. He cleared his throat. I wanted to address the incident that occurred in court. My comments were, they were thud, thud, thud. The noise was louder now, reverberating through his skull. Martin's vision swam, the faces of the reporters blurring together. What is that? He whispered, his voice trembling. Can't you hear it? Murmurs rippled through the room. People exchanged confused glances. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Blake? Samantha's voice was sharp with concern. Are you all right? No, he gasped, backing away from the podium. No, this isn't right. This. But the gavel kept pounding, each strike like a hammer blow to his chest. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind, louder than before, drowning out everything else. He clutched his head, staggering back. I'm not guilty, he shouted, his voice a desperate, ragged plea. I'm not! The room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled forward, shouting questions, their cameras flashing furiously. Samantha rushed to his side, grabbing his arm. Sir, we need to leave, she whispered urgently. Now. But Martin barely heard her. He was trapped, caught in the grip of some unseen force. The gavel's relentless pounding filled his ears, his vision darkening. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. Martin blinked, gasping for breath. The room came back into focus. The horrified faces of the reporters, the shocked expressions of his colleagues. He looked around wildly, his chest heaving. Sir, Samantha whispered, we need to go. Numbly, he let her guide him away, the room swirling around him like a nightmare. The last thing he saw before the doors closed behind them was the stunned faces of his audience, their whispers chasing him down the hallway. That night, Martin sat alone in his darkened apartment, staring at the mirror in the hallway. He knew what he had seen earlier. He knew what he had heard. And no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, to convince himself it was all stress or paranoia, the truth gnawed at him, relentless and insistent. This wasn't just guilt. It wasn't just regret. It was something else. The letters were still there, faint and ghostly on the mirror's surface. Guilty. He ran his fingers over the etching, feeling the cold, unyielding glass beneath his fingertips. What do you want from me? He whispered. The mirror remained silent, its reflection empty and mocking. But as he turned away, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He spun around, heart hammering. The words on the mirror had changed. Face the truth. A cold chill washed over him. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, he reached out and touched the letters. The moment his fingers made contact, a strange sensation rippled through him, like a jolt of electricity. And then the world shifted. The apartment around him faded, the walls dissolving into shadows. The floor disappeared beneath his feet, and Martin found himself standing in that same familiar courtroom. But this time it was full, every bench occupied, every seat taken. And at the judge's bench, Naomi Harris sat, her gaze locked on him. Mr. Blake, she said softly, welcome back. No, he breathed, backing away. This isn't real. But the murmurs of the crowd drowned him out. He turned wildly, searching for an escape, but there was none. The doors were sealed, the windows barred. You have been judged, Mr. Blake, Judge Harris said quietly. And now, it is time to face the consequences. Martin's knees buckled, the weight of her words crushing him. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please, I didn't mean. Intent is irrelevant, she replied calmly. What matters is action, and your actions have brought you here. No, he choked out. No, I'm not. But she raised her hand, and the gavel gleamed in the dim light. Guilty. The word reverberated through the courtroom, shattering the silence. Guilty, the crowd echoed. Guilty. Guilty. The chant grew louder, swelling into a deafening roar. Martin clutched his head, sobbing. No, please, I'll change. But Judge Harris only shook her head, her gaze filled with a terrible, unyielding pity. Change, she whispered, comes only to those who seek it. And then the gavel came down. The world exploded into light, blinding and all-consuming. When Martin awoke, he was no longer in the courtroom. He was back in his apartment, lying on the floor, his body trembling. The mirror stood before him, its surface pristine. But etched into the glass, clear and unmistakable, were two final words: "Seek truth." And Martin, for the first time in his life, realized what he had to do. Not for his career, not for his reputation, but for himself. Because until he did, the nightmare would never end. And somewhere, deep within, Martin knew. The real trial had only just begun. Martin didn't return to the firm the next day, or the day after that. He stayed locked in his apartment, surrounded by the haunting silence of a life that had been stripped bare. The voices of the courtroom still echoed in his head, relentless and damning. Guilty. But this time, he didn't fight it. He didn't try to justify his actions or drown himself in anger. For once, Martin Blake sat alone with his thoughts and allowed himself to listen. He had spent his entire life silencing others, dismissing those he deemed beneath him. He had trampled over colleagues, ruined careers, and shattered lives, all in the name of power, of status, of control. But now, faced with the stark truth of his own actions, he realized something. He had been silencing himself, too. For years he had buried the small, insistent voice inside, the voice that whispered doubts, that questioned his choices, that longed for something beyond ruthless ambition. He had suffocated that voice until it was nearly gone, but not completely, because somewhere, deep inside, it was still there, and maybe, just maybe, there was still time to listen. 1 week later. Martin stood outside a small, nondescript building on the edge of town. The sign above the door read, "Community Legal Aid Center." His heart hammered in his chest as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The receptionist glanced up, startled. She looked young, maybe in her mid-20s, with wide eyes that narrowed in suspicion as she took in his expensive suit and polished shoes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone guarded. Martin hesitated. What was he even doing here? What could he possibly offer to a place like this? I'm here to volunteer," he said haltingly, "if you'll have me." The receptionist stared at him for a long moment, her gaze flicking over him as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she shrugged and nodded toward a door down the hall. "You'll want to speak to Mrs. Jacobs. She's in charge of volunteers." "Thank you," Martin murmured, his throat tight. He made his way down the narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing softly on the linoleum floor. When he reached the door, he took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," a voice called. The woman behind the desk was older, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with years of experience. She glanced up as Martin entered, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Martin Blake," she said slowly, leaning back in her chair. Well, this is unexpected." "You know who I am?" he asked, his voice faint. Mrs. Jacobs snorted. "Everyone in the legal community knows who you are, Mr. Blake, the lawyer who torpedoed his own career in spectacular fashion." She tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "So, what brings you here?" Martin swallowed, feeling more vulnerable than he had in his entire life. I want to help. I want to redeem yourself?" she finished dryly. He flinched. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try. I want to make things right." She regarded him for a long, silent moment, her expression inscrutable. Then she sighed and gestured to a stack of files on her desk. "We've got more cases than we can handle, and not enough hands to manage them. Pro bono work, mostly. Tenants fighting eviction, single mothers trying to keep custody of their kids, people who can't afford fancy lawyers." "I understand," Martin said quietly. "Do you?" She arched an eyebrow. "This isn't glamorous work. There's no fame, no fortune, just a lot of people who need help." "I know," he whispered, "and I'm ready." Another pause. Then, to his surprise, Mrs. Jacobs smiled faintly. "Fine. You can start with these," she said, shoving a pile of files toward him. But don't expect anyone here to roll out the red carpet. You're not special, Mr. Blake. You're just another lawyer, trying to prove he deserves a second chance." "Thank you," Martin breathed, clutching the files as if they were a lifeline. She waved him off. "Save the gratitude. Just get to work." And for the first time in his life, Martin did. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Martin spent every waking hour at the Legal Aid Center, poring over files, meeting with clients, and taking on cases that no one else wanted. It was grueling, thankless work. He often found himself up against wealthy landlords, corrupt employers, and indifferent bureaucracies, but he kept going. Slowly, cautiously, people began to warm to him. The receptionist, whose name was Emily, stopped looking at him with suspicion. Mrs. Jacobs started trusting him with more complex cases. Even the clients, wary and guarded at first, began to see him as something more than a disgraced attorney. He wasn't Martin Blake, the arrogant litigator, anymore. He was just Martin, a man trying to do some good, and in doing so, he found something he hadn't known he was missing: purpose. 1 year later. Martin stood outside the courthouse, his heart pounding. It was a simple custody case, a mother fighting to keep her son after her abusive ex-husband tried to take him away. The kind of case he wouldn't have given a second thought to a year ago. But now, it mattered. She mattered. "Mr. Blake?" The woman, Jasmine, stood beside him, her eyes wide and anxious. Do you think we'll win?" Martin looked down at her, seeing the fear in her eyes, the hope that she was almost too afraid to feel. And in that moment, he realized something incredible. He cared. "I think we have a good shot," he said softly. "And no matter what happens, I promise you, I'll fight for you, for both of you." She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you." As they entered the courtroom, Martin felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation filling his chest. Pride. Not the cold, empty pride of victory that had driven him before, but a deeper, warmer pride, the kind that came from knowing he was doing the right thing, from knowing he was helping. And as he took his place beside Jasmine, as the judge called the court to order, Martin felt something shift inside him. The guilt, the shame, the relentless pressure that had weighed him down for so long, it began to lift, just a little. He wasn't free of it, not yet, but he was on his way. It was 2 years later when Martin received the letter. He sat in his modest apartment, staring at the envelope with Judge Naomi Harris's name on the return address. His hands trembled as he opened it, his heart racing. "Mr. Blake, I've been following your progress. I've seen the work you've done, the lives you've touched, and I want you to know something. I forgive you, not for me, but for you, because redemption is not about the absence of guilt. It's about what you choose to do with it. I wish you peace." Judge Naomi Harris. Tears blurred Martin's vision. He read the letter again and again, the words sinking into his soul. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey he would walk for the rest of his life, but for the first time he believed he could get there. Slowly, reverently, Martin folded the letter and placed it on his desk, and then, with a quiet smile, he picked up his briefcase and headed back to the Legal Aid Center, because there was still work to do. If you enjoyed this story and found the message meaningful, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others who might need a reminder about the power of redemption and change. Subscribe for more stories that delve into powerful themes of transformation, justice, and forgiveness. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Martin's journey, and let us know, do you believe in second chances? And remember, every story has the potential to inspire. So, if you have a story to share, reach out and let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can create a world where everyone's voice is heard.